To many people, World War II is generally divided into three broad areas: the Western European theatre, into which goes the Atlantic and the Mediterranean, and the Eastern Front, into which is also included the Arctic convoys as well as the Black and Baltic Seas, and the Pacific Campaign, which some people might actually remember was divided up between Nimitz and MacArthur into two distinct sub-areas. Pretty much everywhere else is usually seen as incidental and fairly quiet. However, in this video, we're going to start looking at probably the most important forgotten area of the Maritime War, the Indian Ocean. The relative lack of information here is perhaps understandable at a pop history level. The Indian Ocean in World War II saw no great battles between fleets. The only potential setup for one was Operation Sea, and that ended up without direct fleet action. And although a stepping stone to other famous incidents like the loss of Force Z, little else about this area stands out in the common perception. A subsidiary reason might also be that while adjacent to the Pacific Campaign areas, the Indian Ocean turned out to be largely a British and Commonwealth show, which does complicate the very basic narrative you are sometimes sold of the Royal Navy essentially being around Europe and the US Navy being in the Pacific. But in any case, we're going to start out with a look at how the Indian Ocean was set up in the interwar period to deal with future conflict, as well as the opening months of World War II in the Indian Ocean and the Pacific. And then in a subsequent video, we're going to look at an overview of what actually happened there between spring 1942 and when the British Pacific Fleet took over from the Eastern Fleet and headed off to the Pacific. So, at the start of the 1920s, there was a growing consciousness that Japan was likely to be the next major threat to the British Empire. The US Navy, although larger than the Imperial Japanese Navy, and at the behest of ever-changing US administrations which viewed Britain with varying degrees of friendliness and hostility on the global political stage, was seen as relatively unlikely to do anything particularly aggressive against the Empire, partly because of the shared experiences of World War I, and partly because it was fairly common knowledge that, with the Washington Naval Treaties signed, the US's major nightmare was the Japanese and British fighting them at the same time anyway. The end of the Anglo-Japanese alliance had been an ancillary part of those negotiations, and if the British and the Americans went to war, very few doubted the Japanese would use the chance to stick a knife into the US while it was distracted. Even if the Japanese weren't particularly keen on the British anymore, it was just too good an opportunity to miss. However, while the Imperial Japanese Navy was the smaller foe, it was much better placed to fight Britain in the Pacific and Indian Oceans than it was to fight the USA. The US could, albeit at some distance, base pretty much its entire navy on the opposite side of the Pacific in their home ports and then head out across the ocean for war. Conversely, British holdings in Southeast Asia and beyond were on the other side of the planet relative to the UK, and at the start of the 1920s, although there were port facilities enough to support cruisers and cruiser warfare, there were no dockyards from the Suez Canal going east which could support, maintain, and repair a major battle fleet. The largest dry dock in British hands in the area was Cockatoo Island in Sydney, Australia, but at its current size in the early 20s, it could only just about squeeze in some of the Royal Navy's smaller capital ships, and the Queen Elizabeths and the battle cruisers, the most useful ships under the White Ensign at that time, were too large. And even then, it was just one dry dock at the wrong end of Australia to be confronting the Imperial Japanese Navy. Expansion plans were underway, but even then the expanded dry dock would only just about accommodate the Queen Elizabeths. It wouldn't manage to fit the battle cruisers or the upcoming Nelson class. There were other plans in the works though, Singapore being the primary one. This sat at the border of the Indian and Pacific Oceans and was planned to be a major naval base, with extensive modern dockyard facilities and defences. But apart from waiting for the shape of the interwar fleet to emerge from the series of scrappings and new builds that resulted from the Washington Naval Treaty, the Royal Navy was content to let things develop naturally for a little while. After all, the Imperial Japanese Navy was going through exactly the same kind of changes, and tensions in the 1920s were generally relatively low. But as Italy and then Germany began to build up their fleets in the early 1930s after the First London Naval Treaty and the Anglo-German Naval Treaty had been signed, and Japan was becoming more belligerent as well, the Royal Navy began to lobby for more resources. Up to this point, a policy of maintaining general imperial security at, roughly speaking, the tonnages allowed in the Washington Naval Treaty had been seen as an ideal, and this had caused the Royal Navy to enter the 1930s with a navy that was arguably a little bit stronger than the US Navy, since British building programs had been somewhat more aggressive in the 20s than the Americans had been, although this also has about as much to do with the congressional budget policy as it does Royal Navy build policy. But in any case, now a new policy was being suggested. It wasn't quite the two-power standard of pre-World War I days, but broadly speaking, it was now considered that the Royal Navy should be strong enough to have enough ships to fight a decisive campaign in either European or Eastern waters, while maintaining enough strength in the other theatre to deter the strongest navy present there from trying anything until the First War was concluded, or at least to hold the line if the navy in question didn't take the hint. In other words, they wanted to be able to fight either the Germans or the Italians while holding off the Japanese, or fight the Japanese while holding off the Germans or the Italians. Of course, the limits of the treaty system, renewed in the First London Naval Treaty and now looking to be renewed again in the Second London Naval Conference, complicated this by capping overall the tonnage of various kinds of ships that the Royal Navy could build, and also in terms of setting displacement and armament caps that, on specific ship types that weren't necessarily in Britain's interests, particularly, for example, cruisers. The limits in the Washington and First London naval treaties favoured generally building fewer larger units. These were better suited to a single concentrated battle fleet such as the Imperial Japanese or US Navy's planned to have, whereas the Royal Navy, which was distributed across the planet, would have preferred for more smaller ships, as you could be in more areas at once using these, and indeed having unsuccessfully persuaded everybody to follow their example by building the Yorks, Leanders, and Arethusas, they did manage to get this kind of smaller, lower tonnage ship written into the Second London Naval Conference by downscaling the light cruiser to 8,000 tons. Further, an alliance with France would help, as, at least in Europe, the Marine Nationale could then take on a good chunk of naval responsibility if the Royal Navy was called away in bulk to the Far East, and even when they were operating out there, they might have some French help, as the French did have imperial possessions over there that they might want to defend. And of course, flipping things back around, the French were no fans of the Germans or the Italians either, and so this would effectively increase the overall tonnage that could be made available to face off in a potential two-front war. Also key in the early 1930s was the formal lapsing of the 10-year rule, where the Treasury treated funding applications from all three branches of the armed forces under the theory that there would be no major war in the next decade. Although the Treasury would continue to try and use this over the rest of the 1930s, and some books incorrectly claim that Britain was still strictly following it well into the 1930s, it was now no longer legally binding, and the Treasury's attempts to use it, on Royal Navy budgets in particular, would become less and less successful. Although they did, of course, manage to make some inroads into the budgets that the Royal Navy wanted, by using the 10-year rule as more of an informal guideline, and that meant that while the Royal Navy would get more and more funding, particularly from the mid-1930s onwards, it didn't get everything it was asking for, and so decisions had to be made as to where the money would go. Critically for the Indian Ocean in particular, one of the places that lost out on funding, if not ambition, was the ongoing work at Singapore. Unfortunately, as the 1930s progressed, it also became clear that the Royal Navy had been hamstrung in its efforts to expand and modernise by another factor. A combination of the Great Depression reducing public spending overall, and the London Naval Treaty extending the battleship building holiday, as well as regulating some other types of ships more heavily, pushed further building work down the line. And the Great Depression specifically also killed off a lot of mercantile build work from freighters all the way through to ocean liners. Without work, this combination saw the British shipbuilding industry, once the largest on the planet by far and still a relatively potent force in the late 1920s, lose about 50% of its overall capacity during a very short 3 to 4 year period. And that was on top of the reductions that the restrictions of the Washington Naval Treaty, primarily associated with its ban on foreign major warship exports, had already caused. There was also another factor which didn't help, in retrospect at least, a near treasonous scheme whereby various shipyards that were at risk of going under would be bought up on the premise that no work there would be allowed to be done for the next 4 decades, which of course encouraged the building over and scrapping of major parts of those ports' infrastructure, which made it far harder for those ports to be reactivated than a works program, nationalization, or almost literally anything else could possibly have achieved. The Palmer's shipyard, for example, fell victim to this. And so, just as Italy and Germany began their naval rearmament processes, and the Imperial Japanese Navy started not only to ramp up their expansion efforts, but also collapsed the Second London Naval Treaty, the Royal Navy was faced with far less restrictions on what and how much it could build, but they just had their ability to exploit these new horizons cut out from under them very viciously. So with all that said, what did this mean for the Indian Ocean specifically? Well, for a start, it meant that the Indian Ocean was supposed to be a supporting theatre. The so-called Singapore strategy, which was never really a single strategy, more of just a general aim in which quite a lot of different strategies were fitted over the years, technically involved the Indian Ocean because of the location of Singapore, but Singapore was to be the base from which the battle fleet and supporting elements would take a war further east into the Pacific, and thus the Indian Ocean would primarily be a highway for ships coming to and from Europe in order to allow them to enter the conflict which would take place in the Pacific itself, and it would also be a supply line both to the fleet and to and from Australia and New Zealand. The China Station, which would represent a fairly major portion of the Royal Navy's overseas deployments in much of the 1930s, was thus based starting in Singapore and then in forward ports like Hong Kong and Weihai Wei. As various ships went in for modernisation in the late 1930s, thus taking them offline for extended periods, the forces allocated to the Far East were thus heavily geared toward defence, a mixture of cruiser warfare to wreck enemy trade and a strong submarine presence, which could also conduct anti-trade warfare but was more specifically aimed at taking out Imperial Japanese Navy capital ships as they tried to move southwest. For example, in 1937, the main fleet in the area consisted of a carrier, which was largely on anti-piracy duties off the Chinese coast, 4 heavy and 2 light cruisers, a destroyer flotilla, and no less than 15 submarines. If you added in the various smaller squadrons that were dedicated to patrol Africa, India, and of course the Royal Australian Navy, you could bring another 3 heavy and 7 light cruisers to the party, plus some destroyers. War games conducted with this force envisaged aircraft and some of the light cruisers locating an Imperial Japanese invasion convoy, which the whole of the 4th Submarine Flotilla would then be guided into the path of. After they'd finished with it, the cruisers would move in at night to pick off scattered survivors and finish off any damaged ships. If the first mass submarine attack didn't work out, there was space and time enough for them to reload their torpedo tubes and try again, since it was, rather correctly, anticipated that Japanese anti-submarine warfare wasn't really up to much, and the convoys would be quite slow, and thus it would be possible to overhaul them using submarines travelling on the surface at night, or even during the day as long as they kept their distance. When war came to Europe in 1939, the strength of the China Station was 4 heavy and 1 light cruiser, the carrier Eagle, the 21st Destroyer Flotilla, and 13 submarines plus various smaller craft. In the Indian Ocean itself, based at Ceylon, now Sri Lanka, there were 3 more light cruisers, a large number of sloops, and 1 submarine, the Seal. And it should be noted that all of the cruisers were of the latest county and town types. Older C, D, and E class types, as well as the Hawkins class, were all based in and around Europe at this point. The Royal Australian Navy and what was shortly to become the Royal New Zealand Navy could combined contribute another 2 heavy and 6 light cruisers, which would give a total combined strength in large warships of 1 carrier, 6 heavy and 10 light cruisers, and 1.5 destroyer flotillas plus 14 submarines. However, with the outbreak of war in Europe, Ships were called home, or in the case of the Royal Australian Navy, requested to serve in the Mediterranean, and this meant that by the summer of 1941, the China station was down to just 3 old D-class light cruisers and 5 old destroyers. Everything else of any significant size had been recalled. The Royal Australian and Royal New Zealand navies had but 1 heavy and 1 light cruiser left in their waters. Conversely, however, the threat of German Panzerschiff and the occasional U-boat or Hilfskreuzer in the Indian Ocean specifically had seen what at this point was called the East Indies Command grow a little bit, although the forces available were still much reduced from the potential combined heyday. There were no submarines, bar one that they'd captured from the Italians, no destroyers, and in terms of larger ships, there were a handful of armed merchant cruisers, the small carrier Hermes, and a total of 10 actual cruisers, 4 heavy and 6 light. Although of the heavy cruisers, the Exeter and Hawkins were small, and in Hawkins' case also quite old, and in the latter case only HMS Glasgow represented a full-size modern light cruiser, the others being older C and E class, plus HMS Mauritius, which was brand new, but it was of the Crown Colony or Fiji class, which represented a somewhat inadvisable attempt to squeeze a town class's worth of guns onto a hull that was only 4/5 the displacement. At the start of World War II, there had been great plans to reinforce the Far East if Japan kicked off, with ideas to send 7 battleships, another carrier, a dozen cruisers, and 4 flotillas of destroyers. But with France being knocked out of the war, the fact that there was now a fight against both Germany and Italy, and all the losses inherent to fighting that war, this plan was stripped away almost as fast as the forces that had already been based in the Far East were. The loss of the submarines was about to become particularly keenly felt, as they had trained extensively for war in the Pacific and their captains and crews knew the area well, which had in part informed the Royal Navy's view on Japanese anti-submarine warfare efforts. For example, shortly before being recalled to the Mediterranean, where she would be sunk by the far more competent Regia Mariner at the end of 1940, the submarine HMS Regulus had sailed right between Honshu and Shikoku, the 2 of the Japanese home islands, and merrily on into Osaka Bay, and conducted extensive photo reconnaissance of several Japanese ports, before going on to find a Japanese fleet exercise involving the newly commissioned Hiryu, and tagging along for the entire exercise, taking even more photographs, something which the Imperial Japanese Navy was reportedly horrified to learn about when some of these photos and reports were discovered when they captured Singapore. But in summer 1941, it was becoming increasingly clear that something was about to kick off in the Western Pacific, especially since Japan managed to occupy French Indochina, which gave them bases much closer to Singapore, Malaya, and various other British holdings. At this stage, though, there seemed to be some light at the end of the tunnel that was the first couple of years of war. The USA, although still officially neutral, was expanding its neutrality patrols to encompass almost half of the Atlantic, and utilising mostly older ships to do so. This relieved some pressure on the Royal Navy, which was coupled with the relief on the Mediterranean fleet that had resulted from the attack on Taranto in late 1940, as although some Italian ships were now almost finishing their repairs, it had given Cunningham some breathing room, and the battleship Conte de Cavour was still out of action, and Duilio was only just undergoing sea trials following her repairs. That all meant that, for once, there was actually a little bit of extra capacity in the Royal Navy's inventory for a change, and plans for reinforcement of the Far East got underway. The first stage was to be taking the Revenge class off of Atlantic escort duty, refitting them, particularly with an eye towards anti-aircraft protection, and then redeploying them to South Africa, primarily to cover potential commerce raider incursions into the Indian Ocean, while more substantial forces were prepared back home. The next stage was to be the dispatch of Force H, the battlecruiser Renown, the carrier Ark Royal, and 8th Destroyer Flotilla, plus the light cruiser Sheffield, along with a King George V class battleship. Part of this has to be considered in light of intelligence, albeit intelligence we now in hindsight know to be quite faulty, that indicated that Japan had a number of 20,000-ton or so 12-inch armed supercruisers, or small battle cruisers, in commission, which would make for ideal long-distance commerce raiders. And in this context, Force H, backed up by King George V, would make the perfect counter for hunting down even 2 or 3 of these supposed supercruisers operating together, while the R-class, in theory, would provide a similar deterrent on convoys to that which they had done in the Atlantic. Essentially, major shades of Operation Berlin with the Scharnhorst class, only this time the Royal Navy could afford to try and hunt them down actively. To this force were going to be added Nelson and Rodney, since with the anticipated deployment of at least one of USS Washington and or USS North Carolina to the Atlantic, between that and whichever King George V was left behind, there should be more than enough forces to deal with a potential sortie by Tirpitz. Whereas the Nelsons were a little bit too slow for that kind of chase, but they were fast enough to be useful against the majority of the known Imperial Japanese battle line. But in the next few months, these plans would take a series of blows. Nelson was damaged by an Italian torpedo bomber, the US fast battleship commitment to the Atlantic was narrowed down to just one of the North Carolinas, not both, and then finally in November, Ark Royal was sunk by a German U-boat. That, in turn, all meant that Rodney and Renown were still seen as needed back home, as would be King George V and Duke of York when she was worked up, as she'd just commissioned in the autumn. 3 more carriers were due to come online soon. Illustrious and Formidable were completing repairs, and Indomitable had, like Duke of York, just been commissioned. But these ships were all some months out from being available, whereas thanks to the distances involved, if they wanted to have something in place by the end of the year, it really had to be dispatched now. And it was this set of decisions that would see the dispatch of Repulse and Prince of Wales to make up Force Z. They were never intended to be a major force in and of themselves for very long, regardless of what Churchill might have said. Repulse was largely a placeholder for the far more capable Renown, which was expected to be released in early 1942 once Duke of York was ready to take her place in the Atlantic. And the carriers were expected to be made available around the same time as Renown. Additional cruisers and some destroyers were also allocated to that wave of reinforcements. When Anson and Howe, the last of the King George V's, were due to commission in early to mid-1942, a view would then be taken on if this would allow Nelson and Rodney to head east, or if they should be kept in the Atlantic and the 2 new fast battleships sent to join Prince of Wales instead. These revised plans also envisaged a capital ship-heavy Indian Ocean, allowing the more modern cruisers, a mix of the existing and reinforcement vessels, to head further east to raid Japanese convoys and other such like cruiser activities. In October, the plans for deployment were updated again, as the imminence of Japan doing something very soon loomed large, and so a plan was hastily drafted that would be the direct ancestor of ABDA Command. Instead of operating on their own agendas, the Royal Navy, US Navy, and Royal Dutch Navy would cooperate to defend the Malay Barrier in the Southwest Pacific. This, though, would require the bulk of the aforementioned forces to move out of the Indian Ocean and set up shop in Manila alongside the US Asiatic Squadron to more directly confront the Japanese, pending further reinforcement from the Royal Navy and the US Navy's Pacific Fleet. The main restriction on this maneuver being the availability of sufficient destroyers to form a defensive screen against the anticipated attack of Japanese destroyers and submarines. The initial lack of aircraft carriers would in theory be made up for by the air cover provided by US Army Air Force units based on Philippine airfields. Rodney was also briefly mooted as further backup, but as she needed worn guns swapped out, she was allocated to move east along with Nelson once she'd been repaired in early 1942. But of course, circumstances would conspire to derail almost everything about this plan. While Repulse and Prince of Wales did manage to reach Singapore in late 1941, there were not enough destroyers to justify a permanent deployment further forward just yet, and the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th local time was accompanied by a major offensive against the Philippines that went off almost simultaneously, and therefore derailed the idea of forward basing out of Manila permanently. But with the Japanese also rapidly advancing into the Southwest Pacific generally, something needed to be done, and so Force Z, such as it was dispatched to counter Japanese landings in Malaya. As covered in a far more detailed video on a dedicated video I've already done on Force Z, this deployment was critically compromised by 2 intelligence failings and 1 bad miscommunication. The miscommunication gave the impression that there was no land-based fighter cover available anywhere in the area, when in fact it referred to one specific airfield, and the intelligence failings being a major one, which badly underestimated the operational range of Japanese bombers, basing assessments of their capabilities with various payloads on German and Italian twin-engine machines, which led to the conclusion that, at worst, the force could expect to be attacked by level bombers with light payloads. And a lesser intelligence failure, which missed the presence of Imperial Japanese Navy torpedo bomber units altogether. Although this was probably objectively far more important to what actually happened, I rank it as a lesser failure because the units in question had arrived in theatre less than 48 hours before Force Z was sunk, and in a pre-satellite era, getting that sort of information fast enough to be of any use in that time period was almost impossible. Throw in a little bit of bad luck, and the Royal Navy was soon down one fast battleship and one battlecruiser. This immediately forced the Royal Navy onto the defensive. The R-class was still trickling into the Indian Ocean, with only Revenge properly on station, and without Prince of Wales and Repulse, plus with Singapore soon to be under siege, it was clear that offensive operations in strength were pretty much out of the question. What little remaining strength the Royal Navy had in the Southwest Pacific was then rapidly eroded as the ultimately disastrous ABDA command effort saw a number of British and Commonwealth cruisers and destroyers sunk alongside their American and Dutch counterparts in a series of engagements in and around the Dutch East Indies. By mid-December 1941, it was already being pointed out by Admiral Leighton, Philip's successor as commander of the Eastern Fleet, that Singapore was not likely to be a tenable base for long, and any further effort should concentrate on basing the fleet out of Ceylon, bringing the Indian Ocean to the front line. There was even a brief consideration given to sailing the entire Mediterranean fleet through the Suez Canal and over to Ceylon, while hoping that a combination of the surprise of that movement plus increased aerial and submarine attacks would keep the Regia Marina away from the eastern Mediterranean long enough to redress the situation strategically. But the potential impact of losing control of the Mediterranean was quickly realised to be far too great, and although some ships would be transferred from the Mediterranean or diverted from being sent there in the first place, the bulk of Cunningham's forces would remain in place for now. As Japan's advances looked like most of Southeast Asia would fall under their sway, it was also realised that although the British had interests in the Pacific and the Americans had interests in the Indian Ocean, the Imperial Japanese Navy was soon going to effectively split these operational areas in two, unless you went the really long way around the south of Australia. And so the Pacific was about to become a largely American show, while the Indian Ocean would primarily be the responsibility of the British and their other allies. A maximum effort paper looked at stripping every other Royal Navy operational area of anything but bare bones capacity. This concluded that, in theory, it was possible to have 9 battleships and 3 carriers plus appropriate escorts in the Indian Ocean by the spring of 1942, a scale of force that might actually give the Japanese Navy pause. Although still not superior to the entirety of the Japanese Navy, with the US Navy coming at the Japanese from the Pacific side of things, it would likely be superior to anything the Japanese could afford to spare. But once again, a series of other events disrupted these plans. Italian special forces crippled the Queen Elizabeth and Valiant in Alexandria. The Channel Dash would see a potential concentration of 3 German capital ships, once repairs were completed, in the North Sea or the Arctic, and the realization that with the Dutch East Indies oil fields under Japanese occupation, another 50 tankers would be needed to haul fuel from the Middle East to supply such a fleet, finally put the nail in that particular coffin for the moment. Still, the Royal Navy was determined to do as much as it could, and so the newly patched up battleship Warspite was sent to join the R-class, adding almost visible levels of plot armour to the Indian Ocean's defences. And of the 3 carriers that were now available, 2 of them, Formidable and Indomitable, were also sent to join the Eastern Fleet. Illustrious was also due to go, but she rammed Formidable in a storm on her way across the Atlantic and came off rather the worse of the 2, thus having to divert to the UK for more repairs, although she was earmarked to head over there once those repairs were completed. It would therefore be this force, the 4 Revenge class and Warspite, plus Formidable and Indomitable, and a small number of cruisers and destroyers, that would be split into two groups to face off against the Kido Butai in March 1942, when they surged into the Indian Ocean, minus Kaga, in an effort to raid British holdings and potentially wipe out the last major element of potential opposition west of Pearl Harbor. Again, there's a couple of videos dedicated to that operation that I've already done, a link to all those videos in the description below. But overall, the outcome of this raid was nowhere near as bad as it could have been. Although the carrier Hermes, the cruisers Dorsetshire and Cornwall, and two destroyers plus some smaller craft were all sunk, the bulk of the Eastern Fleet remained intact. This raid, however, changed the Royal Navy priorities again. They now reckoned that not only might the Imperial Japanese Navy be back soon, but that in daylight they realised the Japanese carrier strength, both in numbers of carriers and on a per-carrier basis in numbers of aircraft, was considerably greater than the Royal Navy's, and intercepted communications from the German ambassador in Tokyo indicated that the Japanese had told him that they indeed planned to hit Ceylon again, possibly seize it, and then possibly progress further westwards into India. There were still plans to build up the Eastern Fleet with a target of getting 5 modern battleships and no less than 7 carriers into position, a force that would be enough to check any plausible Japanese advance, and of that target all the capital ships and 5 carriers could be in place by August. But that meant the existing Eastern Fleet had to survive until August, and that meant the fleet would have to withdraw for now from the eastern end of the Indian Ocean to the western end, and hope that air power and or US intervention distracting the Japanese in the Pacific would keep Ceylon safe for the moment. To this end, the battleship Valiant, under repairs, was earmarked to be sent to the Indian Ocean, as were Nelson and Rodney, which were both now working up. The brand new Anson and Howe were now definitively tagged to head over. Illustrious would, as we've said, be sent over as soon as her bow was patched up, and Eagle and Furious were to round out this initial force once they got out of refit. On top of all that, the 1942 Light Fleet Carrier program was about to start work on churning out numerous additional flight decks, most of which would be sent here, although they wouldn't be ready for a while. In the interim, some of the precious small force of escort carriers could also be diverted. They, at least, were arriving in larger numbers considerably sooner. It was anticipated that the 3 Illustrious class would between them be able to field no less than 60 radar-guided torpedo bombers and 80 fighters, of which 50 would be the Fleet Air Arms version of the F4F Wildcat. That, interestingly enough, would actually have put the Royal Navy's fighter and torpedo bomber strength sitting somewhere between that of the US Navy's carriers and the Japanese Kido Butai at the Battle of Midway, albeit with no dive bombers, which both of the other fleets also possessed in fairly large numbers. But for all that ambition to come to pass, security in the western Indian Ocean was needed, and there was a potential thorn in the Allied side in the shape of Vichy-held Madagascar. Although ostensibly neutral, Vichy's Axis leanings were well known at this stage, and it was feared that either Germany and Japan would pressure Vichy into allowing Imperial Japanese Navy forces to stage from there to attack the Eastern Fleet, the most likely anticipated threat being submarines, or in the worst case, should Ceylon fall but Vichy France refuse the Japanese Navy access to Madagascan ports, the French defences there were unlikely to stop the Japanese just taking it anyway if they were particularly determined, and that would sever the round-the-Cape supply route to the Mediterranean Fleet and trap the Eastern Fleet in a small kill box in the northwestern Indian Ocean. And thus, the first true offensive by the Eastern Fleet and the first sustained campaign in the Indian Ocean would begin, but not against Japan, it would be against Vichy France.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.